What if the strongest warrior who ever lived never lost a single fight? What if her soul woke up again? 3 hours old, screaming, with a fox sealed into her stomach and something else sealed in right beside it. He doesn't remember Malenia. He doesn't remember the wings, the rot, or the vow he made to a brother who isn't Sasuke. But by the time he figures out what he's carrying, it's already decided what it's carrying him toward. This is Naruto, Blade of Konoha.
She dreamed the same dream she always dreamed at the end, the one that wasn't a dream at all but a memory wearing a dream's clothing. Butterflies. Wings the color of old blood, stitched together out of her own hair, lifting her into a sky that didn't belong to her anymore. A voice, hers, but slower than she remembered speaking, thick with something rotted through, apologizing to someone who wasn't there to hear it. "Oh, dearest brother, I'm sorry. I finally met my match she had never lost. Not once, not in any battle that mattered, and she was losing now. And the strange thing, the thing that didn't make sense even inside the dream, was that it didn't feel like losing. It felt like setting something down that she had carried for so long her arms had forgotten what empty felt like. The flower opened in her chest, scarlet, blooming, patient, and then the dream did something dreams weren't supposed to do. It didn't end. It reached, backward, sideways, into a place with no butterflies and no golden trees and no brother waiting at the foot of a dead husk of a tree for a promise that would never be kept the way she thought it would be kept. It reached into a scream, not a scream. A woman's scream, in a language the dream had no name for, in a village built from wood and paper seals instead of stone and gold, under a sky torn open by something enormous and orange and nine-tailed. And the dream, the memory, the whatever it was, poured itself down through that scream like water finding a crack in a wall, and found, waiting at the bottom of it, an infant's heartbeat. It liked the shape of that heartbeat. It had been looking for a new shape for a very long time. It went in quiet, the way rot always does. It didn't announce itself. It just started, patiently, to bloom. The night the nine-tailed fox attacked Kanoha, nobody was thinking about seeds. They were thinking about the tailed beast's claws tearing through the tree line, about the screaming, about the way the third Hokage summons fought and fought again against something too large for any single jutsu to answer. They were thinking about the fourth Hokage, standing alone on the back of a colossal, toad with his newborn son cradled against his chest and his wife bleeding out on a rock beneath him, doing the only thing left to do. Minato Namikaze had built the seal for exactly this. He hadn't built it for anything else. "I'm sorry," he told the baby, and the baby, 3 hours old and already screaming louder than any 3-hour-old, had a right to scream, did not understand him, would never remember him, would spend the rest of his life not knowing that his father's last words to him were an apology for a burden neither of them had asked for. "I'm sorry. There wasn't another way." The seal took shape across the infant's stomach in lines of black ink and something colder than ink. A Fuinjutsu array 800 years in the making, condensed into a single desperate night. The nine-tails roared above them, a sound like the sky itself tearing along a seam, and Minato drove the technique home with the last of everything he had. Something happened in the half-second between, before, and after that nobody in that clearing was equipped to notice. The seal wasn't just a container. A seal, at its truest level, is an invitation, a door built in the specific shape of the thing it's meant to hold, so that the thing recognizes its own shape and settles rather than fights. Minato had built a door in the shape of a fox. But doors built in a hurry are never perfectly sealed at the edges. And there are things in the world, old things, patient things, things that predate the god tree whose fruit had given birth to chakra itself, that spend eternity doing nothing but waiting at the edges of doors for exactly this kind of gap. It did not come in with violence. It came in the way water finds a crack in old stone. Slow, certain, uninterested in force because force was never necessary. By the time the last line of the seal closed, sealing 9 taels worth of ancient malice into a body the size of a loaf of bread, something else had already slipped through alongside it, curled itself into the deepest, quietest corner of that same small body and gone still, waiting to bloom. Minato never knew. He didn't live long enough to notice anything was wrong. He kissed his son's forehead, told the toad summoned to get him somewhere safe, and let go of a life that had already spent everything it had to spend. Inside the seal, in the lightless non-place where the Ninetails existed now as something folded small and furious, the fox went rigid. Kurama, because that was the name it had, buried under 9 taels worth of centuries and rage, a name almost nobody living remembered to use, had felt many things get sealed alongside him over the millennia. Curse tags, binding chains. Once memorably, an entire clan's collective grudge packed in like sawdust around a nail. This was different. This didn't smell like chakra at all. It didn't smell like life. It smelled like something life was afraid of. Kurama had lived long enough, had been sealed inside enough vessels, human and otherwise, to develop an instinct for danger that had nothing to do with strength. Strength he understood. Strength he could measure, could respect, could hate cleanly, and simply the way he hated the Uchiha who'd first enslaved him with a borrowed eye. This wasn't strength. This was appetite, a small, cold, patient hunger that had apparently been drifting at the edge of the world for who knew how long, looking for exactly this kind of opening, and had found it in the same half-second Kurama himself had been shoved through the door. He tried to burn it out. Instinct, nothing more, 9 taels of furious, red, boiling, killing intent, thrown at the thing curled in the dark beside him the way you'd throw a torch at a spider in your bedroll. It didn't burn. It didn't even flinch. It simply waited, the way it had apparently been waiting since before there were foxes at all to be angry about anything. And something about the patience of it was worse than if it had fought back. "What are you?" Kurama didn't ask, because things like this didn't answer questions, they only answered time. The child's heart went on beating, small and human and entirely unaware, in the dark above them both. Sarutobi Hiruzen, 3rd Hokage, retired now for exactly 1 day before being handed the hat back with blood still drying on the streets outside, held the orphaned infant in the hospital that had somehow, miraculously, remained standing through the whole catastrophe. He had expected many things from that night. Grief, certainly, an entire generation of it, stacked up in every hallway of every hospital in the village. He had expected fear, and he'd gotten that too, already, in the hushed and ugly way the nurses looked at the child in his arms, in the way one of them had asked, in a voice trying very hard to sound like it wasn't asking what it was asking, whether it was safe to have the boy in the same ward as the other newborns. He had not expected the flowers. It was a small thing. It would have been easy to miss, if he hadn't been sitting with the boy through the small hours of that terrible night, turning the weight of an entire village's future over and over in his hands like a stone he didn't know how to put down. There was a vase on the windowsill, someone's well-wishes, forgotten and unclaimed, chrysanthemums gone a little tired from 3 days without fresh water. At some point past midnight, with the infant finally, mercifully asleep against his chest, Hiruzen looked up and found the chrysanthemums blooming, not wilting further. Blooming, opening past anything a chrysanthemum should be capable of, petals unfurling in slow, wrong, scarlet-edged spirals, the green stems beneath them going soft and dark, as though the plant were pouring the last of its life into one final, spectacular, unnecessary flowering before it collapsed into itself entirely. By morning the flowers were a puddle of black rot at the bottom of the vase, and the water they'd been standing in had turned the faint, ugly red of diluted wine. Hiruzen did not report this. He told himself, in the tired, rationalizing voice of a man who has already decided what he's going to do before he's finished thinking about why that flowers die, that it had been a long and terrible night, that grief plays tricks on tired old eyes. He had the vase quietly removed the next morning anyway. And he made a note, not in any official record, but in the private, locked drawer of his own memory, the one he kept for things that were dangerous specifically because no one else could be allowed to see them yet, to watch the boy. He named him, on the fourth's own private request left behind in a sealed letter, Naruto. After a character in a book his student had written, a hero in that book. Hiruzen hoped, without much conviction, that the name would matter more than the flowers had. The uncanny things kept happening. In the years that followed, in the small, deniable way uncanny things always do when nobody wants to look at them directly. At 3 years old, in the cramped, sour-smelling apartment the village had begrudgingly assigned him, Naruto fell down a short flight of concrete steps chasing a stray cat and split his knee open badly enough that the old woman 2 doors down, one of the few adults in that building who didn't flinch at the sight of him, gasped and scooped him up to run him to a clinic. By the time she got him there, the wound had already closed. Not healed, closed in the wrong order, skin knitting itself shut from the outside in rather than the inside out. And for 1/2 second, before her eyes adjusted and told her she must have imagined it, she could have sworn the new skin at the center of the scrape had a faint red vein running through it, like a thread of something left behind on purpose. The Kyuubi's residual chakra granted Jinchuriki accelerated healing. Everyone who knew what Naruto carried assumed that was all this was. Nobody thought to ask why the scar tissue. On the rare, unlucky occasions a cut was deep enough to leave one. Sometimes came in the faintest shade of scarlet and faded to normal skin tone only after a week or two, as if something underneath were slowly, deliberately withdrawing its hand. At 5, in the small, overgrown lot behind the orphanage he'd since been asked to leave, quietly, without cruelty, simply without anyone quite finding a reason to keep him. He sat alone in the weeds because the other children wouldn't sit with him and cried the specific, exhausted, furious tears of a child who does not yet have words for the shape of what's wrong, only the feeling of it. The weeds around him, for a radius of perhaps 3 feet, went from green to black to a fine gray ash in the span of about 4 minutes. He didn't notice. He was 5. He was busy being sad. By the time he'd cried himself out and wandered off to find something to eat, the little circle of dead earth around where he'd been sitting had already been rained on twice and covered over by fresh growth pushing up eagerly through the corpse of the old. The way things in an untended lot always do. Nobody official ever saw it. Almost nobody official ever saw any of it across those years, not because it wasn't happening, but because Naruto Uzumaki, unwatched, unloved by any hand that mattered enough to be believed, kept his uncanny moments in the places unwatched, unloved children keep everything. Alone in the dark. In the corners, nobody thought to check. Almost nobody. Hiruzen Sarutobi kept his private note. He kept it for 6 years, adding to it in small increments, a report from a Chunin medic who'd treated the boy for a fever, and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, an odd discoloration in the chakra pathways near his abdomen that resolved before a second reading could confirm it. A complaint from a civilian gardener about a public flowerbed near the academy that had, twice now, died overnight in a spiral pattern nobody could explain. And that happened, both times, to be a flowerbed the boy walked past on his way home. None of it, on its own, meant anything. Sarutobi had spent a long enough life to know that most things that look like a pattern are just loneliness looking for a shape to blame. But he was also old enough to know that the 2 times in his life he had ignored a pattern because it was inconvenient to believe in both times. The pattern had eventually cost lives. So on a gray morning in early autumn, the day before Naruto's 6th birthday, Hiruzen did something he had put off for 6 years specifically because he was afraid of what it would confirm. He summoned Kanoha's most trusted seal master, a woman with Uzumaki blood herself, one of the last, quiet enough and loyal enough to be trusted with something this sensitive, and asked her, very simply, to examine the boy's seal. Not the fox. Everyone had already examined the fox, extensively, in the anxious months after Minato's death. He asked her to look past it, underneath it, at whatever, if anything, might be sitting quietly in the space the fox's own presence had been drawing everyone's attention away from for 6 years. She agreed, because one did not refuse the hawkage, and because she was curious in the specific, careful way of someone who has spent her whole life around seals and has learned that curiosity, handled correctly, keeps you alive. She was not prepared for what she found. It took her the better part of an afternoon, working in a private, warded room with young Naruto asleep on the table between them, sedated gently, the way you'd sedate a child for a routine procedure. No cruelty in it, only caution, layer by layer peeling back the enormous, magnificent architecture of the fourth hawkage seal, admiring it in spite of herself, even as her stomach turned tighter and tighter with every layer she cleared. And at the very bottom, past the fox, past the 8 trigrams, past every failsafe Minato had built into a seal he'd never imagined anyone would need to look behind, she found something that wasn't a seal at all. It didn't have edges. It didn't have a shape she could map the way she'd map a jutsu or a bloodline marker. It was more like she would struggle for the right word for years afterward and never quite land on one that satisfied her, a stain. A single point of chakra, ancient beyond anything she recognized, dormant and small and utterly, patiently, wrong, curled at the very root of the boy's own chakra network like a seed pushed down into soil long before anyone thought to plant a garden there. She reached toward it, very gently with a thread of her own chakra, the way any seal master reaches toward an unknown mark to test its edges. The stain did not react with violence. It did something far worse. It opened one eye, not literally. There was no eye. There was nothing in that dark, coiled point that resembled a face at all. But she felt it, unmistakably, the way you feel someone wake up in a dark room you thought was empty, and turn slowly to look directly at you. She pulled her hand back so fast she knocked over the tray of sealing ink beside her. And it took her 3 full minutes, sitting on the floor of that warded room with her back against the wall and her breath coming in short, controlled bursts, before she trusted her own voice enough to go find the hawkage and tell him, as evenly as she could manage, that they needed to talk. Immediately. About something she did not, in 6 years of training as a sealer, have any name for. Sarutobi listened to her report in silence, his pipe going cold, unsmoked in his hand. When she finished, he sat for a long moment looking at nothing in particular, the way old men look when they are doing the arithmetic of a decision they already know they're going to have to make regardless of the answer. "Does it grow?" he finally asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know what it's waiting for." Outside the window, in the small garden the hospital kept for patients well enough to sit in the sun, a 6-year-old boy nobody official was watching sat by himself on a bench, kicking his feet, humming something tuneless and off-key, entirely unaware that 2 adults in a warded room above him had just discovered that whatever slept curled at the root of his soul had, for the first time in 6 years, opened its eyes. It went back to sleep within the hour. It always went back to sleep, but it had looked. And now it knew, the way a seed in the ground knows spring is coming long before the frost breaks, that eventually, not soon, but eventually, someone was going to give it a reason to bloom. By the time he was 12, Naruto Uzumaki had failed the graduation exam twice, and the entire village had more or less agreed, without ever saying so out loud in a way he could point to and argue with, on what kind of person that made him. It didn't make it true. It just made it easier for everyone else. He'd learned to live around the edges of that agreement the way you learn to live around a bruise, carefully, favoring the other side, pretending most days that it didn't hurt because pretending was cheaper than the alternative. He ate ramen alone at a stand run by one of the only 3 or 4 adults in the village who looked at him like a kid instead of a roomer. He pulled pranks that were, if he was being honest with himself in the rare moments he allowed himself that particular luxury, at least partly a controlled experiment. If I make enough noise, will anyone finally look at me and see something other than what they've already decided to see? The answer, so far, had mostly been no. but he kept running the experiment anyway, because the only thing worse than being seen as a menace was not being seen at all. Iruka Umino was the exception, and Naruto knew it, and never said so, because saying it out loud felt like it might jinx it. "One more clone," Iruka said, for what had to be the fourth time that afternoon, standing in the training yard behind the academy with his arms crossed, and his patience visibly, admirably, holding on by threads. "Just give me one clean bunchin, Naruto, that's all it takes." Naruto formed the hand seal. Focused, or tried to, the way he always tried, throwing everything he had at the technique the way you'd throw your whole body against a door that wouldn't open, more force than precision. Because force was the only tool anyone had ever bothered to teach him he was good at. The clone that stumbled into existence beside him was gray, hollow-eyed, and collapsed sideways into the dirt within 4 seconds, looking less like a shadow clone and more like something that had crawled fully formed out of a grave and immediately regretted the decision. "That's..." Iruka started, and then, because he was one of the only people in Naruto's life who bothered to finish sentences kindly even when the honest ending wasn't kind at all. "That's an interesting variation on the technique." "It's garbage," Naruto said flat before Iruka could find a gentler word for it. "I know it's garbage, sensei. You don't gotta be nice about it." "I'm not being nice. I'm being accurate. It's garbage and it's interesting," Iruka said, and something about the honesty of it, the refusal to either lie to him or write him off, was the exact reason Naruto would have, did eventually, though neither of them knew that yet, walked into fire for the man. What neither of them noticed, because it was such a small thing, so easy to miss against the general chaos of a failed technique, was that the clone hadn't just collapsed from a normal chakra depletion. It had come apart the way a piece of fruit comes apart 3 days past its prime, softening from the inside, a faint dark tinge spreading up through the gray from where its feet had touched the ground, gone entirely by the time either of them thought to look twice. Chakra clones dissolved into smoke. This one, for just a moment, had dissolved into something that looked uncomfortably like rot. Neither of them mentioned it. Neither of them, in fairness, had actually seen it clearly enough to know there was anything to mention. Mizuki had been watching Naruto for a long time, in the specific, patient way of a man building a case for himself he intended to use eventually. He was good at that kind of patience. It was, in its own ugly way, the only real skill he had that mattered. He found Naruto that evening on a swing near the empty academy yard, alone, the third failed exam still sitting in him like a stone he hadn't found anywhere to put down, and he did what he'd been planning to do for weeks. He was kind. Carefully, calculatedly kind, in exactly the shape kindness needed to take to land on a boy who had spent his whole life starving for it. "There's another way to pass," Mizuki said, crouching down to Naruto's eye level with an expression built entirely out of borrowed warmth. "A secret test. Iruka can't tell you about it. It's against the rules for him specifically. But I can." The lie was simple, and it worked exactly the way lies built out of someone's loneliest hope always work. Completely, immediately, without resistance. Because Naruto wanted so badly for there to be one more door left open to him that he didn't stop to ask why it was a door only Mizuki seemed to know about. He stole the forbidden scroll that night. He made it 3 miles into the forest before Iruka found him, and by then he'd already unrolled it far enough to start clumsily working through the first technique written on it. The shadow clone technique, the real one, the one his instructors had never let him near because everyone assumed, wrongly and cruelly, that giving Naruto more chakra to work with was giving a child a loaded weapon. Naruto. Iruka's voice, when he found him, carried a complicated cocktail of relief and fury that only people who genuinely care about someone can manage to blend in equal parts. "What are you doing? Do you have any idea what you've—" "I'm passing the test," Naruto said, defensive, already halfway convinced by his own hope that this was going to work out, that Mizuki hadn't lied to him, that there was, somewhere, a version of this story where he got to be the hero of it instead of the punchline. Mizuki-sensei said if I learned one technique from the scroll, I'd. Uruka's face went through several rapid, unpleasant realizations in the space of about 2 seconds. Mizuki told you that. It was not, by the time either of them fully understood what was happening, a question anymore. The clearing where Mizuki found them a few minutes later had the particular quality of a place about to become the site of something the forest would remember long after everyone involved had left it. The kind of ordinary patch of ground that history, in its careless way, occasionally decides to sink its teeth into. Mizuki didn't bother with subtlety once he arrived. There wasn't any reason left to. "Well done, Naruto," he said, and the warmth was gone from his voice now, peeled back to show what had always been underneath it. "Hand over the scroll." "Naruto, don't." Uruka started, already moving, already understanding faster than the boy beside him what was actually happening. "You should know why everyone in this village hates you," Mizuki said, ignoring Uruka entirely, savoring the moment with the specific cruelty of a man who has been waiting years for permission to say something out loud. "You want to know the truth about the Ninetails, about the fox everyone's always whispering about behind your back? It's you, Naruto. You're not its jailer. You are it. The demon that killed the fourth Hokage's been living inside your skin since the day you were born, and every single person in this village who's ever looked at you like you were something to be afraid of. They were right to. There is a version of this story, the one that happened, more or less, in every world Naruto might have been born into, where this is the moment everything hinges on. A boy hearing the worst possible thing about himself, at the worst possible age, from the worst possible person, in the worst possible way, in this world. Something else heard it too. It had been sleeping a long time, curled at the root of a chakra network it had chosen, patiently, almost lovingly, the way something ancient chooses the one shape it plans to wear for the rest of its unnaturally long life. And it had been waiting without hurry for exactly this kind of moment. Not a moment of anger. Anger was cheap. Anger happened every day, and it had learned, over a very long dormancy, not to bother stirring for it. This was a moment of threat. Genuine, immediate physical threat. Aimed not at the boy himself, but Mizuki's hand was already closing around the hilt of one of the enormous shuriken slung across his back. And his eyes had already found Uruka, standing between them, refusing to move, at the one person in this small, mean, unfair world who had ever treated the boy like he was worth defending. Something in the dark at the root of Naruto's chakra opened its eyes for the second time in his life. And this time, it did not go back to sleep. Mizuki's giant shuriken left his hand a half-second before Uruka threw himself in front of it, close enough that both of them would remember, for the rest of their lives, exactly how narrow that half-second had actually been. It never reached him. Later, much later, in a private room with the third Hokage and a seal master who had spent 6 years dreading exactly this evening, Uruka would try to describe what he saw, and would fail every single time to find language that made it sound like anything other than a fever dream. The air around Naruto had gone wrong, was the closest he ever managed to get. Not glowing, not burning, nothing so clean as either of those words implied. It had gone the color of something left too long in standing water, a dull, viscous red-brown that seemed to swallow the moonlight rather than reflect it, and it had risen off the boy's skin like heat off summer pavement. Except heat doesn't make the grass 6 feet away wilt flat and black in under a second. The shuriken didn't so much stop as it dissolved, not instantly, not cleanly, but the way iron dissolves in acid if you leave it long enough, the honed steel edge sagging into something soft and pitted mid-flight, clattering to the ground 3 feet short of Uruka's chest as a warped, corroded lump that would later require 3 separate chunin to explain in 3 separate reports, none of which agreed with each other. Mizuki didn't get the chance to be afraid of the shuriken. He was already afraid of the boy. Naruto had moved. He would never afterward be able to describe how, would only remember it as a gap in his own memory, a door he walked through without recalling the walking. And by the time Iruka's vision cleared enough to track him, Naruto's hand was closed around Mizuki's forearm. And Mizuki was screaming, not from a wound, from the absence of one, in the specific, horrifying sense of a man watching a wound happen without any of the mechanics a wound usually requires. No blade, no fire, no blunt force, just Naruto's small hand wrapped around his arm and the skin beneath that hand going soft, then dark, then open, in spiraling patterns that looked less like an injury and more like something blooming. "Naruto?" Iruka's voice cracked through the clearing, and it was that, not Mizuki's screaming, not the wrongness in the air, but Iruka's voice specifically saying his name with fear for him instead of fear of him, that reached whatever was left of the boy underneath all of it. The red-brown haze guttered. The pattern spreading up Mizuki's arm stopped advancing. Hung there, held in place by something that seemed almost reluctant to let go of what it had already claimed. And Naruto, 12 years old, exhausted past the point exhaustion usually goes, staring down at his own hand like it belonged to somebody else. Let go. Mizuki dropped to his knees, cradling an arm that would take the hospital's best medical nin the better part of 2 weeks to fully stabilize, and didn't say another cruel word for the rest of that night. He didn't have anything left in him that wasn't fear. Naruto swayed on his feet, drained in a way that went past chakra exhaustion into something closer to having been hollowed out with a spoon, and looked up at Iruka with an expression that was already, before he'd even fully processed what had just happened, bracing for the same fear he'd just watched bloom across Mizuki's face. He didn't get it. Iruka crossed the last few feet between them, knelt down and, carefully, the way you'd approach something you loved that had just proven it could hurt you and chose not to, pulled his own forehead protector off and tied it around Naruto's head, hands not quite steady, voice not quite steady either. "You did good," Iruka said, which was not remotely everything that needed saying, and was, somehow, exactly enough for that particular moment. "You did good, Naruto." Naruto cried, finally, the specific unguarded way exhausted 12-year-olds cry when someone finally gives them permission to stop being brave for 1 minute. And neither of them mentioned, that night or for a long time afterward, the smell that clung to the clearing until well past sunrise. Sweet and rotten, like fruit forgotten at the bottom of a bowl, fading slowly into the ordinary green smell of an ordinary forest, as if the whole clearing were healing over a wound nobody could see. Sarutobi Hiruzen received 3 separate reports before dawn, and read all 3 of them twice before he allowed himself to feel anything about their contents. The first was from Iruka, official and carefully worded, describing Mizuki's betrayal, the theft of the scroll and Naruto's role in stopping him, in the flattering, simplified language that would go into the boy's permanent record and, with luck, finally tip his reputation somewhere closer to what he'd actually earned that night. The second was from the medical nin who'd treated Mizuki's arm, technical and clinical, and considerably less flattering, describing tissue necrosis with no identifiable mechanism of injury, and requesting, in the dry, careful language medical nin use when they don't want to sound as unsettled as they are, a consultation with Kanoha's SEAL division regarding an anomalous chakra signature. The third report had no official form at all. It came, unsigned, slipped under his office door sometime before sunrise, and said only, in handwriting Hiruzen had learned to recognize and dread over 4 decades of quiet political war. Interesting development regarding the Uzumaki boy. We should discuss his future training. D. Hiruzen sat with his cold pipe in his hand for a long time after reading that last one, watching the sun come up over a village that had no idea this morning how close it had come the night before to something it wasn't remotely prepared for, and no idea either that at least one person already watching from the shadows had decided, quietly, that unprepared or not, this was an opportunity. He would have to move faster than he'd planned, faster than he wanted to. There was a boy in the hospital right now, exhausted and half convinced he'd finally done something right for once in his short, unlucky life. who had no idea that the thing sleeping inside him had just opened its eyes wide enough for at least one very dangerous man to notice. And that from here on, it was no longer a question of whether the village would eventually have to reckon with what Naruto Uzumaki actually was. It was only a question of who reckoned with it first. He picked up his pen and began drafting the paperwork for a new genin team assignment, choosing the Jonin instructor's name with considerably more care than the Academy's usual formula would have suggested. Because if something in that boy was going to keep waking up, piece by piece, across the years ahead, Hiruzen intended to make absolutely certain it wasn't Danzo Shimura standing closest when it finally, fully opened its eyes. Team 7 came together the way most things in Naruto's life came together. Badly at first, and only barely on purpose. Kakashi Hatake failed them on the first day with the specific weary cruelty of a Jonin instructor who has learned that kindness given too early gets people killed later. 2 out of 3, he told them, would be sent back to the academy. It took Naruto exactly 1 meal, shared grudgingly, tied to a post while Sakura and Sasuke pretended not to be starving out of pride, to understand what the real test had been, and exactly 1 moment of standing between Kakashi's kunai and a bound, undernourished Sakura for him to pass it anyway. Rules be damned. "You're an idiot," Sasuke told him afterward, without much heat in it, in the specific tone boys that age use when they mean something closer to "I noticed what you did, and I'm choosing not to make it weird." Takes one to know one. Naruto shot back, grinning, and didn't examine, wouldn't have known how to examine at 12. The strange, low hum of recognition that moved through him every time Sasuke was in the room. It didn't feel like rivalry exactly, though it wore rivalry's clothes well enough to fool them both. It felt older than that. It felt like something in him had been waiting for longer than his own life had technically existed to find this specific person and stand next to him. He didn't have a name for the feeling. He wouldn't for years. He just knew that when Kakashi announced the C-rank mission that would take them to the Land of Waves, and Sasuke's eyes lit up at the prospect of a real fight the way Naruto's own chest did without his permission. Something in him settled, quietly, like a key finding its lock. The demon brothers were a warning. Zabuza Mamachi, when he came for them properly on the road to Wave, was something closer to an education. Kakashi's Sharingan bought them the half-second they needed to survive the first exchange. It did not buy them a victory, and for 1 long, ugly minute in a mist so thick, it swallowed sound along with sight. Team 7 learned exactly how far outclassed a Genin cell actually was against a Jonin, who'd made killing his entire personality. It was Kakashi's own gambit, a sacrifice play that nearly cost him everything, that ended the fight before it ended someone's life. And it was a masked Hunter Nin, appearing out of nowhere to claim Zabuza's corpse. That left all 3 Genin standing in a clearing afterward with far more questions than answers. Naruto noticed in the wreckage of that fight that his hands hadn't shaken once. He'd expected them to. Everyone else's had. He said nothing about it. There wasn't yet anything to say. The tree-climbing exercise Kakashi set them was meant to teach chakra control, and it did, for Sakura, easily, and for Sasuke, with the grim, competent frustration of someone used to things coming quickly and resenting the one time they didn't. For Naruto, it did something else entirely. He put too much chakra into every attempt, the way he put too much of everything into everything, and the bark under his feet on the 3rd failed try didn't just crack from the strain of overcorrection. It sagged, briefly, softening under his heel like fruit gone a day too ripe, before springing back to ordinary hardness so fast he told himself he'd imagined it. He didn't tell Kakashi. He told himself it was nothing, filed it in the same drawer he'd been filing strange things his whole life, the wilting flower beds, the dissolving clone, the 2 weeks Mizuki had spent unable to fully close his hand. The drawer marked things that are wrong with me specifically, that I am not going to hand anyone else a reason to be afraid of. It was in the woods near that training ground that he met a boy, or thought it was a boy, wouldn't be sure for a while yet, gathering herbs with quiet, careful hands who told him, in the unhurried voice of someone who had already made peace with something Naruto hadn't yet had to face, that people become strong when they have someone precious to protect. "You have someone like that?" the stranger asked. Naruto thought about it longer than the question probably warranted. He thought, without quite meaning to, of Sasuke's face in the mist a few days earlier, sharp with fear neither of them would ever admit to out loud. "Yeah," he said finally, "guess I do." He didn't learn the stranger's name that day. He would learn it and what it cost, much sooner than he wanted to. The bridge, when Zabuza and his hunter Nin finally revealed the whole shape of their deception, turned into the worst afternoon of Naruto's short life almost immediately. Haku's ice mirrors closed around Sasuke like a held breath. A perfect dome of reflective cold with the boy trapped at its center and a Senbon quick shape flickering between every panel of it. Too fast for eyes that hadn't been trained specifically for this kind of fight to properly track. Naruto threw himself at the outside of the dome before Kakashi could stop him, pinned immediately by a mirror image forming behind him too, both of them boxed into the same freezing prison within seconds. "Ninja who break their promises are trash," Haku said, quiet and almost apologetic even as Senbon rained down in patterns too fast to fully dodge. "But ninja who abandon their comrades are worse than trash." It wasn't cruelty. That was almost the worst part. Whoever this was, they believed every word of it, and meant Naruto and Sasuke no more personal harm than a river means harm to a stone it happens to be wearing down. Naruto took hit after hit trying to shield Sasuke's blind side. And Sasuke, proud, furious, unwilling to be protected by anyone, least of all him, took just as many trying to do the same in reverse. Until neither of them could entirely tell anymore whose blood was whose on the ice beneath their feet. It was watching Sasuke go down, actually down, folding sideways into the frozen floor of that mirror dome with Senbon buried in a pattern too precise to be anything but deliberately non-lethal and looking, for one horrible unbroken second, exactly like someone who wasn't getting back up. That finally cracked something loose in Naruto that had been sealed shut since the day he was born. It didn't come as rage, not exactly, though rage was in it somewhere. It came the way it always came, quiet first, a held breath before the flood. The temperature in the dome, already brutal with cold, took on a different, wrong kind of chill, not colder, but rotten cold. The specific creeping wrongness of standing too near a wound that's gone bad. The ice beneath Naruto's feet, everywhere his chakra reached, began to discolor, a slow brown-red bruise spreading through what should have been perfectly clear crystal. And then it stopped spreading. Just stalled, the way a fire stalls against wet wood, refusing to catch no matter how much fuel got thrown at it. Naruto didn't understand in the moment why the power that had dissolved a thrown shuriken and rotted a grown man's arm to the bone was suddenly, infuriatingly sluggish against a wall made of frozen water. He only understood that it wasn't working the way it had worked before, that whatever this ice actually was underneath its cold, it was pushing back against him with something that felt less like resistance and more like cleansing. His own power meeting something that unmade it a little with every second of contact, the way water unmakes rust if you leave it running long enough. He hit the mirror anyway. Again, with his fists this time, plain chakra-reinforced strength because the other thing wasn't cooperating, screaming Sasuke's name into a dome that swallowed sound the same way the mist had. It was the 8th or 9th strike, human effort, not the power underneath it, that finally spiderwebbed a crack through one panel wide enough to get an arm through, that did what the rot alone couldn't. Haku, for reasons that had nothing to do with the crack, and everything to do with a choice being made somewhere behind that porcelain mask about a man on the far side of the bridge, they, Naruto still didn't have the right word yet and wouldn't for a while, loved more than her own life. Let the mirrors fall. What happened afterward, Gato's betrayal, the small army of thugs he'd brought expecting an easy cleanup of 2 spent shinobi. Zabuza's last furious charge through a crowd of them with no jutsu left, only a kunai clenched in his teeth and something that looked, for the first time since anyone on that bridge had met him, almost like joy, happened fast and ugly, and mostly without Naruto in the middle of it, because Naruto was on his knees beside Sasuke checking, with hands that had finally, belatedly started shaking. That his idiot rival/teammate/whatever this was actually breathing. He was. Barely. Sasuke would need 2 days flat on his back, and Sakura's increasingly competent field medicine before he was walking properly again. And he would deny, for the rest of his life, that his last conscious thought in that dome had been relief that Naruto hadn't been the one to take the worse hits. Haku died on that bridge anyway, in the end, not to Sasuke's blade, not to Naruto's power, but stepping into Kakashi's Chidori rather than let it reach Zabuza. A choice made with the same quiet, unshakable devotion she'd tried to explain in the woods a few days earlier. Zabuza, watching it happen, made a choice of his own in the minutes that followed that surprised absolutely everyone, who'd assumed they understood exactly what kind of man he was. Naruto cried at both funerals, for people he'd known less than a week, in the specific unguarded way that had already become the closest thing he had to a signature. Nobody laughed at him for it. Even Sasuke, standing a careful distance away with his arm still in a sling, didn't quite manage to keep his own face steady through the whole thing. It was 2 nights later, back at Tazuna's house, that Kakashi finally found a private moment to look at what he'd actually seen on that bridge. He hadn't said anything at the time. There hadn't been time, and some part of him, the tired, careful part that had learned the hard way not to react visibly to things that scared him, had simply filed it away to examine later, the way you'd set aside a live wire until you had gloves on. But he'd watched the whole fight through the Sharingan, every second of it, and there was a particular half-moment, Naruto's hand pressed flat against that ice mirror, the crimson-brown stain spreading and then stalling beneath his palm, that his borrowed eye had captured in far more detail than his conscious mind had time to process in the moment. He sat with it that night alone, replaying the memory the Sharingan let him keep, and made himself actually look this time, past the visual wrongness of the thing, into the chakra signature itself, the way a lifetime of training had taught him to read. It didn't read like chakra. Not entirely. There was chakra in it, plenty of it, tangled up with something underneath. Something with no coil structure he recognized, no elemental affinity that matched any of the 5, moving through Naruto's network like a second circulatory system laid directly over the first, feeding off it, or being fed by it. Kakashi genuinely couldn't tell which. He'd read enough medical texts, called in enough favors over the years, seen enough of what the Sharingan could and couldn't make sense of to know the difference between "I don't understand this yet" and "this is not supposed to exist." This was the second one. He sat very still in the dark of Tazuna's guest room for a long time, turning the image over and over, and thought, with the specific cold clarity of a man who has just realized a 12-year-old under his direct protection is carrying something he has absolutely no idea how to defend against. Should it ever decide to stop cooperating, that he was going to need to have a very careful conversation with the Hokage the moment they returned to the village. He did not yet know that the Hokage already knew. He did not yet know how much that would end up mattering in the years still coming, or how little time either of them actually had left to decide what to do about a boy who was, without any warning either of them had been given, starting slowly, unevenly, one bloom at a time, to wake up. Kakashi laid the memory out for the Hokage the same way he'd laid it out for himself 2 nights running in the dark of a borrowed room in Wave, carefully, without embellishment, letting the Sharingan's recording speak for itself rather than trying to soften or sharpen what it showed. Sarutobi listened to the whole of it without interrupting, and when Kakashi finished, the old man did something Kakashi hadn't expected. He reached into a locked drawer of his desk, one Kakashi had never once seen opened in 15 years of reporting to this office, and set down a sealer's report 6 years old, written in a hand Kakashi didn't recognize, describing a stain at the root of a 6-year-old's chakra network that had, for one moment, opened its eyes. "You should have told me," Kakashi said, quiet, and it wasn't quite an accusation because he understood, even as he said it, exactly why the old man hadn't. "I should have told someone," Sarutobi agreed. "I wasn't certain until now that it wouldn't have simply given Danzo a reason to move first." He set the report down between them like a confession. "It's grown, Kakashi, whatever it is. It answered a genuine threat in wave the way it answered Mizuki a year ago, reflexively, defensively, and each time with slightly more of itself awake than the last. What happens when it's fully awake?" Sarutobi didn't answer that. Neither of them had an answer to give. "Watch him closely during the exams," the Hawkage said instead, after a long silence. "Not as a threat. As a boy who is going to need someone paying attention when the thing sleeping in him finally meets something strong enough to make it want to stay awake." Kakashi thought, without saying so, that he already had a fairly good guess as to what kind of thing that might turn out to be. He just hoped, walking out of that office, that they'd have more warning than they'd had in Wave. They would not. The Chunin exam opened, as it always did, with a written test designed to punish anyone foolish enough to answer it honestly and reward anyone clever enough to recognize that the real test had nothing to do with the questions on the page. Naruto passed it the way he passed most tests that weren't about raw effort, badly, loudly, and by accident, saved at the last possible second by a declaration about never giving up that made Ibiki Morino, a man who had broken hardened enemy shinobi for a living, allow himself the smallest, most reluctant smile of the entire exam. The second test waited for them at the edge of a forest that had earned its nickname honestly. 44 Training Ground, Anko Mitarashi told the assembled genin, grinning in a way that suggested she found their nervousness personally delightful. Also known as the Forest of Death, because things in there have historically found ways of making that name accurate. You'll have 5 days to reach the tower at the center with a matched pair of scrolls. Try not to die. I mean that literally more than I usually would. Team 7 entered on schedule, focused, cautious, and, in Naruto's case specifically, carrying a low, persistent unease he couldn't fully name, the specific animal awareness of something in the tree line that felt less like a threat and more like a predator already watching. The way rabbits know a hawk's shadow before they've consciously registered the shape of it. He didn't say anything about it. He'd learned by now which of his instincts were worth voicing out loud, and this one, vague, wordless, more felt than understood, didn't yet qualify. It should have. The Kusagakure genin who approached them on the second day, polite and unassuming and asking after their scroll with the careful diplomacy of a stranger feeling out a potential trade, was not actually a Kusagakure genin at all. And the moment the disguise came apart, not gradually, but all at once, skin sloughing away like a snake, shedding something it no longer needed, every one of Naruto's badly articulated instincts screamed at once that the hawk's shadow had finally arrived. Orochimaru did not introduce himself. He didn't need to. The killing intent that rolled off him in that clearing was a physical thing, a pressure that dropped Sakura to her knees and locked Sasuke's whole body rigid with a fear so total it looked, for one terrible second, indistinguishable from paralysis. "Sasuke Uchiha?" Orochimaru said, tasting the name the way he'd taste something he intended to consume eventually. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." What followed was not a fight so much as a demonstration. Orochimaru toying with 3 genin the way a much larger predator toys with something already caught, testing Sasuke's reflexes, his instincts under pressure, the shape of his potential with the clinical, patient interest of a man auditioning a vessel for a body he already intended to wear eventually. It ended, as it was always going to end, with Sasuke pinned and helpless, and Orochimaru's neck stretching in a way necks were not built to stretch. Teeth closing on the side of his throat and driving a mark into his skin that would, in the weeks ahead, spread and pulse and whisper things in a voice that wasn't quite Sasuke's own. Sasuke screamed. Naruto had never heard him make a sound like that before, and something in him, the same something that had answered Iruka's danger and Sasuke's fall in a dome of ice, came fully, violently awake before his conscious mind had finished registering the threat. He was moving before he decided to move, a kunai already in his hand, and it was only Orochimaru's own casual, contemptuous ease that let the Sannin catch his wrist mid-strike without so much as looking directly at him. "Interesting," Orochimaru said. It was the first time all afternoon he'd sounded genuinely curious about anything. He didn't say what was interesting. He simply held Naruto's wrist, unbothered by the boy's furious, useless struggling, and looked not at his face, not at his stance, but somewhere past all of that, the way a man with decades of forbidden experimentation behind him looks at chakra signatures the way other people look at handwriting, reading history in it that the person carrying it doesn't even know is there. Something in Orochimaru's expression shifted. Not fear. Orochimaru had made a career out of not experiencing fear the way other people did, but something adjacent to it. Recalculation. The specific stillness of a man who has just discovered his afternoon's plans might need revising. "Your chakra," Orochimaru said slowly, "is lying to me." He tightened his grip, testing something, and Naruto felt it the instant it happened. A probing thread of foreign chakra pushed into his network alongside the pressure of Orochimaru's hand. Curse-mark chakra, the same corrupted, coiling energy that had just been driven into Sasuke's throat. Reaching for the same kind of foothold, it found no foothold at all. It found something closer to teeth. The reaction was instant and entirely outside anything Naruto could have controlled even if he'd known it was coming. The dormant thing at the root of his chakra network, still more instinct than intention, recognized the intrusion for exactly what it was, not a threat to his body, but a rival curse. Another old, patient, parasitic thing trying to root itself in soil that was already, quietly, spoken for. And it did not tolerate the company. Orochimaru's hand, where it gripped Naruto's wrist, began very suddenly to blacken, not burn. Rot. The pale skin at his fingertips going soft and dark in spiraling patterns identical to the ones that had spread up Mizuki's arm a year earlier. Except faster now, hungrier, climbing toward his wrist in seconds rather than the slow minutes it had taken the first time. And where the curse-mark chakra he'd pushed forward met that corrosive tide head-on, it didn't simply lose. It came apart, unraveling like thread pulled loose from a seam, as though whatever ancient thing lived under Naruto's skin found Orochimaru's decades of careful, blasphemous cultivation to be nothing more than a rival weed worth clearing out of its garden. Orochimaru released him and stepped back with an expression Naruto had never seen on an adult's face before, not once. In 12 hard years of being looked at by adults who were afraid of him, this wasn't fear of what he might do. This was the specific, hungry fascination of a collector who has just discovered something in the wild worth far more than anything currently in his collection. How extraordinary, Orochimaru murmured, flexing blackened fingers that were already, slowly, beginning to knit themselves back toward something resembling normal flesh. "Tell me, little Uzumaki, do you have any idea what you are?" Naruto didn't answer. Couldn't. Something had shifted loose in him during that half-second of contact. A door that had been cracked for years, finally swinging the rest of the way open. And the red-brown haze that had only ever flickered at the edges of him before, in the woods behind the academy, on a bridge in wave. Didn't flicker this time, it rose. It rose off his skin in a slow, deliberate column, thick and viscous and wrong, and the grass beneath his feet went black in a widening circle. And somewhere behind him he heard Sakura's voice, thin with terror, saying his name in a tone that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with someone watching a friend become a stranger in real time. He wanted to stop. Some small, exhausted, 12-year-old part of him buried underneath whatever was answering Orochimaru's curiosity instead of his own will. Wanted very badly to stop, the way you want to stop a fall you've already started falling. He didn't know, in that widening, rotting circle of dead grass with Orochimaru watching him with open delight, and Sasuke unconscious on the ground and Sakura's voice climbing toward a scream, whether he still had the ability to. It was Sakura who stopped him in the end. Not a jutsu. Not an adult with decades of experience in exactly this kind of crisis. A 12-year-old girl who was more frightened than she had ever been in her life, running toward the one thing every survival instinct she owned was screaming at her to run away from. She didn't think about it. That was, afterward, the only way she could ever explain what she'd done. There hadn't been a decision in it, just her body moving before her fear could catch up and stop her, crossing the widening circle of blackened grass to grab Naruto's wrist with both hands and hold on. Naruto. Not a scream this time. Small and close and absolutely certain. Come back! The red-brown haze didn't vanish so much as it exhaled, the pressure of it easing off his skin in slow, uneven waves, like something enormous deciding, reluctantly, that it wasn't finished but could wait. Naruto's knees buckled the instant it released him, and Sakura went down with him rather than let go. Both of them collapsing into a patch of grass that was, a few feet in every direction, thoroughly and permanently dead. Orochimaru watched all of it with the unhurried patience of a man who had just gotten everything he needed from an afternoon's work, and saw no further profit in staying to watch the rest. "How very interesting," he said again, softer this time, mostly to himself, already turning away. "Sleep well, little Uzumaki. I imagine we'll speak again once you've woken up properly." He was gone before Sakura found the strength to stand and place herself, shaking, between Naruto's unconscious body and the empty space where a Sannin had just been. The month that followed the forest passed in the strange, suspended quality of time before something everyone can feel coming actually arrives. Sasuke fought the curse mark in silence, the way he fought everything that frightened him, alone and badly, refusing help from anyone who offered it. Disappearing for hours at a time to train against an opponent none of his teammates could see. Naruto watched him do it and said nothing, because he didn't have words yet for the thing he'd felt in that clearing, not just the terror of the mark biting into Sasuke's throat, but the strange, wordless certainty underneath his own panic that whatever was happening to Sasuke was happening to both of them, in different shapes, and that neither of them had asked for any of it. The preliminary rounds came and went in a blur of a dozen small dramas. Shikamaru's clever, reluctant victory. Neji's cold dismantling of a cousin he'd spent years hating for reasons that weren't really her fault. Sakura and Ino fighting each other to an exhausted draw that cost both of them, a friendship neither had realized they still wanted to save. Naruto won his own match against Kiba with nothing more exotic than stubbornness and a well-timed shadow clone, and was privately, fiercely grateful that it hadn't required anything else. He was starting, in the quiet hours after the forest, to be afraid of what anything else might look like the next time it was needed. He didn't know yet how soon that would be. The finals opened under a clear sky, a packed stadium, and a genjutsu so thoroughly woven into the ordinary noise of the crowd that almost nobody noticed the exact moment the day stopped being what everyone thought it was. The invasion, when it came the way Orochimaru did everything patiently from multiple directions at once, timed to a heartbeat he'd been counting toward for years. Sound and sand forces poured through breaches in the genjutsu's cover. The Kazekage disguised form revealed itself as Orochimaru's own, and Kanoha's carefully ordered festival day collapsed, in the space of about 90 seconds, into the specific chaos of a village discovering, all at once, that the war it thought it had avoided had simply been waiting politely in the wings. Naruto lost track of Sasuke almost immediately, chasing, he'd learn later, a rapidly deteriorating Gaara, driven half-mad by his own tailed beast's hunger for chaos and the crumbling of a mask he'd worn his whole life. He lost track of Sakura a few minutes after that, swept into the effort to get civilians clear of a stadium that was no longer remotely safe. He found the academy children by accident, in the worst possible way, 3 of them, no older than 7 or 8, herded by a terrified Chunin toward an evacuation route that put them directly in the path of something enormous, and sand-colored, bearing down on the district with a speed no evacuation plan had accounted for. Gaara, half-transformed, one entire side of his body given over to a crude, monstrous shell of sand and single yellow eye, driven by something in him that wasn't fully Gaara anymore and wasn't fully Shukaku either, wasn't targeting the children specifically. He was barely targeting anything at all, past the point of caring what stood between him and the destruction he'd apparently decided the whole village owed him. That didn't make the outcome any different. A building was already coming down in his wake, and the Chunin herding the children had frozen, correctly, in the specific paralysis of someone who has just understood there is nothing in their own skill set capable of stopping what's coming. Naruto didn't have a plan either. He had 3 seconds, a stretch of open ground, and the specific, total unwillingness to let this be the moment his own restraint finally cost someone else their life. He would never afterward be able to describe cleanly how the next 4 seconds actually happened. He experienced them the way you experience a fall, too fast for narration, arriving all at once at the far side of an event his body had clearly navigated without waiting for his mind's permission. What the stadium and the fleeing crowds and every shinobi still upright in that district saw was this: a boy in an orange jacket leaping into the air above a half-transformed monster 3 times his size, trailing something behind him that didn't look like chakra at all, a spray of dark, wet crimson light, thick as blood and moving like it had weight, coalescing around both his hands into blades that hadn't existed a half-second earlier and wouldn't exist a half-second later. He came down on Gaara's sand-shelled arm in a single strike that should have shattered against it and didn't. Instead, for one horrible, beautiful instant, the sand itself seemed to rot, granules clumping and darkening and sagging like something organic finally succumbing to a wound, before Naruto was already airborne again, closing distance for a second strike, and a third, 3 impossible dashing slashes that redirected an arm the size of a house just enough, just barely enough, to send its crushing weight into an already collapsed building instead of 3 screaming children. It wasn't clean. It wasn't the effortless, weightless grace of something that looked like it belonged in this world. It looked, to every terrified onlooker who caught even a fraction of it, like watching a person fight something ancient using a body that was actively being ruined by the attempt. And by the time Naruto's feet hit the ground on the far side of that final strike, the sandshell arm withdrawing on some instinct of its own, half corroded and smoking faintly at the edges, his own right hand had gone a mottled, cracked black-red from fingertip to wrist. Skin split in patterns too deliberate-looking to be an ordinary burn. He didn't feel it yet. He would, badly, in about 90 seconds, once whatever had carried him through those 4 seconds finished retreating and left him alone in his own body again to deal with the bill. Gaara, staring at him from a face that was half his own and half something monstrous, went very still. Something in his single visible human eye, not fear, not quite, but the specific shock of a creature that has spent its whole life being told it was the only monster in any given room, recognizing, for the first time, another one held for a long moment before a distant signal. Some order called down from further back in the retreating sand lines pulled him backward, away, out of the district entirely. The children were already being swept up by the Chunin, sobbing, unharmed. Naruto stood alone in the wreckage for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was, staring at his own ruined hand, before the pain finally caught up to him all at once and drove him to his knees. Half the district had seen it happen. By nightfall, all of Kanoha would have heard some version of the story, most of them not remotely accurate, several of them a great deal more frightening than the truth, and none of them Naruto would learn with a familiar, tired ache in his chest, particularly kind. Across the village, on a rooftop overlooking a different, quieter kind of catastrophe, Sarutobi Hiruzen fought the last battle of his life against a student he had trained with his own two hands, decades before Orochimaru had become the thing standing in front of him now. The first and second Hokage rose out of Orochimaru's summoning in bodies that weren't fully their own anymore, puppets built from corpses and forbidden technique, forced to fight a man each of them had once in life respected. Sarutobi fought all three of them at once inside a barrier that made retreat and rescue equally impossible. Aging with every technique he called on that his body no longer had the reserves to spend easily, and somewhere in the middle of that long, brutal, private war, he made his peace with exactly how this particular evening was going to end. He thought, in the final minutes, less about Orochimaru than about a boy across the village whose right hand was, at that exact moment, cracking open under the weight of a power neither of them had ever fully understood. He thought about the sealed report in his desk drawer, and the seal master's careful notes, and every quiet, insufficient thing he'd done across 6 years to buy that boy time he was rapidly running out of ways to keep buying. You could still stop this, Orochimaru said, almost gently in the brief lull before the final exchange. Retire gracefully, sensei. Let an old man's war end an old man's way. I intend to, Sarutobi said, and meant something entirely different by it than Orochimaru understood in the moment he said it. The dead demon-consuming seal took shape behind him in a hand seal older and hungrier than almost any technique still practiced in the elemental nations. A jutsu that traded the caster's own soul for the chance to seal something the world couldn't otherwise survive. Sarutobi drove it forward with the last of everything he had left to spend, and Orochimaru's arms, mid-motion, mid-reach for a killing blow, went numb and useless as the Shinigami's grip closed around a soul that had, for 70 years, never once been for sale. You'll never use those hands to hurt anyone again, Sarutobi told him, voice already fading, the price of the technique catching up to him fast now. That will have to be enough, his last coherent thought, as his body finally gave out and folded gently backward into the arms of the Anbu who reached him a half-second too late to save him, was not of the village, or of the legacy he was leaving unfinished, or even of the old, complicated grief he still carried for the boy dying in front of him who had once been the student he'd loved best. It was of a private letter, sealed in his own desk that morning before the finals began, addressed to whichever hands took up the Hokage's hat next, containing 6 years of careful notes about a curse older than chakra itself, and a single instruction underlined twice: protect him, not the village's investment in him. Him, he did not live to see whether that letter reached the hands he'd hoped it would. Danzo Shimura watched the aftermath of that day from a rooftop of his own, some distance from both the stadium and the barrier where his old rival had just died, and felt none of the grief the rest of the village would spend the following week drowning in. He had already received 3 separate reports by sundown describing, in increasingly breathless detail, exactly what had happened in the Academy Evacuation District. A boy's hand trailing corrosive red light, sand rotting on contact, 3 children saved by something that made every witness who described it lower their voice afterward, the way people lower their voices around things they aren't sure they're supposed to have seen at all. He had also received word, an hour earlier, of Sarutobi's death. 2 facts, arriving on the same evening, that most of the village would spend the coming weeks treating as unrelated tragedies. Danzo did not make that mistake. He understood, with the specific cold clarity that had let him outlive every rival he'd ever quietly outmaneuvered, that the one obstacle who had spent 6 years standing between himself and a weapon he had wanted since the night it was first sealed into an infant's stomach was no longer standing at all. He did not smile. Smiling had never been useful to him. He simply turned without hurry and began walking back toward Root's hidden quarters, already composing, in the patient, methodical part of his mind that had built an entire secret army out of exactly this kind of opportunity. The shape of everything he intended to do now, that nothing was left to stop him from doing it. They buried the third Hokage on a gray morning with the whole village in attendance, and Naruto stood at the back of that crowd with his right hand still wrapped in bandages that hadn't fully stopped weeping a faint, rust-colored fluid, feeling, for the first time in his life, like the grief around him might actually have something to do with him personally rather than being one more thing happening at a village he merely lived in. He didn't know yet about the letter. Jiraiya did. The Toad Sage had been summoned back to the village within a day of the invasion, older and grimmer than the boastful, easygoing reputation that preceded him. And it was Kakashi, quietly, without ceremony, in a back room of the memorial building while the funeral crowds were still dispersing outside, who handed him the sealed scroll Sarutobi had left in his desk that morning, addressed to whoever ended up needing it most. Jiraiya read it twice. He'd known, in the vague, uneasy way old friends know things about each other's burdens without ever quite discussing them directly, that something about the seal on Kushina and Minato's son had worried Sarutobi more than the Ninetales itself ever had. He hadn't known the shape of it. Reading Sarutobi's careful account of a stain at the root of a child's chakra network, 6 years dormant and now, unmistakably, awake, he understood for the first time exactly how much weight the old man had been quietly carrying alone. "I'm taking the boy," Jiraiya told the interim council 2 days later, in a tone that made it clear he wasn't asking permission so much as informing them of a decision already made. "Officially, we're finding Tsunade to fill the empty seat. Unofficially, I have some old debts to a couple of dead friends that I intend to start paying down." The road was good for both of them, in the specific, uneven way roads are good for people who have both spent too long carrying things alone. Jiraiya taught him toad summoning in fits and starts between drinking, spying on hot springs with a diligence that would have been more embarrassing if it weren't so consistent, and, in the quiet hours neither of them talked about afterward, asking careful, indirect questions designed to map the exact shape of what happened in the Forest of Death without ever making Naruto feel like a specimen being studied. "Your mother," Jiraiya told him one night, apropos of nothing, staring into a campfire with an expression Naruto had never seen him wear before, was an Uzumaki, last of a clan that used to run a whole hidden village before it got wiped off the map by people who were afraid of exactly how good Uzumaki were at sealing things. "I know that much," Naruto said. "Iruka-sensei told me once, doesn't really help me know what she was like." "She was terrifying," Jiraiya said, and there was real fondness in it. "Scariest woman I ever met, and I've met Tsunade on a bad day." She also spent the last few years of her life going through everything left of Uzushiagakure's old archives that Kanoha had managed to preserve. Looking into something she never fully explained to me, old seals, older than the village itself. Meant to hold things that predate the Sage of Six Paths' own bloodline. I always assumed it was academic curiosity. Uzumaki liked collecting the impossible the way other clans collect land. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire. "I don't think it was curiosity anymore," he said. "I think she already suspected, somehow, what might come through with the fox that night. I think she was trying to build something, just in case." They found it 3 weeks later, in a half-collapsed storage vault outside a ruined district of what had once been Uzushiagakure. A scroll case sealed with 3 separate layers of fuinjutsu, one of them keyed specifically, impossibly, to Naruto's own chakra signature. As if Kushina had somehow known, before he was even born, exactly whose hands were meant to open it eventually. Inside was a single design, not a finished technique, but the blueprint for one, in Kushina's own hurried, elegant handwriting, alongside notes that made even Jiraiya go pale reading them. She had never seen the specific thing sleeping in her son. She hadn't needed to. She'd read enough of Uzushiagakure's oldest, most carefully buried records to know that something older than the god tree's chakra had, once long ago required an Uzumaki solution. A needle, not a cage, something that didn't seal the thing away so much as it cut a clean, temporary line between it and the person carrying it, buying lucidity rather than victory. If you're reading this, her note said, in a line Naruto would read so many times over the following weeks that he wore the ink slightly thin with the oil of his own fingers, it means I wasn't there to explain it to you myself. I'm sorry for that. I hope, more than I have ever hoped for anything, that you never need what's written here. But if you do, I made sure it would be waiting. It took Jiraiya and a specialist seal master he trusted, the same woman who had first found the stain 6 years earlier, summoned quietly to a safe house under an assumed reason, the better part of 2 weeks to translate Kushina's design into something that actually existed, forged finally into a slender, unassuming sealing needle of tempered silver-white metal, inscribed along its full length with characters too small to read without a trained eye. The first time Naruto used it, sitting cross-legged in a warded room, driving the needle carefully into a specific point at his own wrist under Jiraiya's watchful supervision. Exactly as the notes instructed, the change was immediate and almost disorienting in its relief. The low, constant hum of wrongness he'd carried in the back of his own skull for as long as he could remember, so familiar he'd stopped consciously noticing it years ago, went quiet. Not gone. He could still feel the thing curled at the root of him, patient as ever. But for the first time in his life, it felt like something sitting a careful, respectful distance away from the wheel, rather than a hand permanently hovering over his own on the steering column. "How long does it last?" he asked, voice a little unsteady with how strange the silence felt. "Your mother's notes say a few hours at most before it needs to be reset," the seal master told him. "It's not a cure, Naruto, it's a held breath. Use it when you need to think clearly. Don't mistake it for permission to stop being careful." He nodded, and didn't say out loud how much just knowing the tool existed had already changed the way his own hands felt, holding a kunai for the first time in months. Tsunade, when they finally found her in a gambling den 3 towns further along, took one look at Naruto's still-healing right hand, the scarred, faintly discolored tissue that had never quite returned to normal skin tone since the invasion, and went very still in a way that had nothing to do with the boy's cheerful, exhausting attempt to convince her to come back and take the hat. "Who treated this?" she asked, all business now, turning his hand over with the clinical, gentle efficiency of the finest medical nin the elemental nations had ever produced. "Field medics, right after," Naruto admitted. "They said it should have healed up weeks ago." "It should have." Tsunade's chakra, threading carefully into the damaged tissue, found something that made her frown deepen the longer she searched. "This isn't scarring, it's dormant. Whatever did this to you left something behind that your own healing keeps building around instead of through, the way a tree grows around a nail instead of pushing it out." She looked up at Jiraiya, and something passed between the 2 old teammates that didn't need words. A confirmation of exactly how seriously she should be taking whatever her old friend had dragged her out of retirement to look at. It was, in the end, Tsunade's own diagnosis as much as Naruto's stubborn, unbreakable conviction and a Rasengan throne with everything he had that finally convinced her to pick up the Hokage's hat. She told herself it was about the village. She knew, watching Naruto sleep off chakra exhaustion in the corner of an inn room that night, that it was really about the boy specifically, about being one of perhaps 3 people alive who had any real chance of managing whatever was sleeping in him without either weaponizing it or letting it kill him. The men who found them on the road home 3 days later did not announce themselves the way villains in stories were supposed to. They simply appeared, one enormous and shark-toothed with a blade wrapped in bandages slung across his back, the other slight and calm-eyed beneath a straw hat, both wearing black cloaks patterned with red clouds that Jiraiya recognized immediately and did not bother pretending he hadn't. "Akatsuki," he said, stepping in front of Naruto without any particular hurry, the way a man steps in front of a threat he's already decided he can handle. "We only want the boy," the slight one said, in a voice so quiet, and even it was almost more unsettling than if he'd shouted. "There doesn't need to be violence, Jiraiya-sama." "There's always going to be violence," Jiraiya said. "I'm just deciding how much of it." It was the larger one, Kasama. Jiraiya would confirm later, a name that meant something ugly in Kirigakure's own recent history. Who moved first, testing the distance with an opening strike that Jiraiya blocked easily enough to make clear the gap between their skill levels wasn't close. It was the enormous, bandage-wrapped blade on his back. In the brief moment, it grazed close enough to Naruto's own defensive stance to matter, that did something neither Akatsuki member had been expecting. Same Hada fed on chakra. It was the whole design of the weapon, the reason Kasama carried it at all. A living blade that tasted whatever it cut and grew stronger on what it consumed, indiscriminate and hungry in a way that made it nearly unique among shinobi weapons. It tasted Naruto's chakra for less than half a second, in the glancing edge of that first exchange, and recoiled, an actual physical recoil. The bandages around its jagged scales shuddering as if the blade itself had just bitten into something rotten and wanted, urgently, to spit it back out. Kasama's grip faltered, just slightly, just long enough for Jiraiya to press the advantage and drive both intruders back a full 10 feet. "Same Hada doesn't do that," Kasama said, low, and for the first time since he'd appeared, something in his voice had shifted from menace toward genuine, professional unease. He looked past Jiraiya at Naruto with new and different interest. Interesting. It was the second time in 6 months someone dangerous enough to end Naruto's life without much effort had used that exact word about him, in that exact tone. And Naruto was beginning to understand that interesting, from people like this, was rarely a compliment worth receiving twice. Itachi's dark eyes lingered on Naruto for one long moment, unreadable, careful, giving away nothing before he spoke, quiet and final. "We're leaving. This isn't the day." They vanished into the tree line without further engagement, and Jiraiya let out a breath he'd clearly been holding since the moment Same Hada had recoiled, watching the space where they'd been with an expression that suggested he understood, better than he wanted to, exactly how much worse that encounter could have gone. Several days' travel away, in a hidden base built into a hollowed mountain, Kasama gave his report to a small, shadowed circle of cloaked figures with considerably less bravado than he'd carried into the fight. "Same Hada wouldn't feed," he said, and the admission clearly cost him something. "It's never refused chakra in its life. Whatever's actually sitting in that kid isn't just tailed beast chakra. Extraction protocols we've used on every Jinchuriki so far, I don't think they're going to work clean on this one." "Explain," said a voice from the shadows, calm and patient in a way that made the whole room go a little quieter. "I've seen a curse-based technique corrode on contact with something and die trying to root in it," Kasama said slowly, choosing his words with unusual care for a man not known for careful words. "I've seen chakra-eating weapons refuse a meal exactly once before in my life, and that was a corpse 3 days rotted that should never have been swinging a sword at all. Whatever's in that boy isn't extra chakra sitting on top of the fox. It's something the fox is holding down. Pull the fox out without understanding what you're pulling the lid off of, and I don't know what happens. Nobody in this organization knows what happens. That should probably worry us more than it seems to be worrying anyone in this room right now." The silence that followed lasted long enough that even Kasama, who did not consider himself an anxious man, found himself uncomfortable in it. "Then we will need," the calm voice said finally, "a different kind of plan for the 9-tailed vessel than the one we had. Patience, in this case, costs us nothing we weren't already prepared to spend." Kasama said nothing further. He had done his job, reported what he'd seen, made his warning as clear as he was able, and it was not his place, nor his particular talent, to guess what patience from an organization like this one was actually going to end up looking like, once it finally decided to stop waiting. Sakura found Sasuke on a bench near the village gates the night he decided to leave, and said everything a person can say to try to stop someone who has already, quietly, finished making up their mind. "You'll destroy yourself," she told him, crying in the way she'd promised herself she wouldn't. "Whatever Orochimaru's offering you, it isn't power, Sasuke, it's a leash. You'll lose everything that makes you you." "I've already decided what I'm willing to lose," Sasuke said, and there was no cruelty in it, which somehow made it worse. He looked at her for a long moment, something almost gentle moving behind eyes that had spent 2 years training themselves not to show gentleness to anyone. "Thank you," he said finally, quiet, "for everything," and left her sitting alone on that bench with a strike to the back of her neck gentle enough to leave her merely unconscious rather than hurt. It was, in its own broken way, the kindest thing he did that entire night. The Sound Four met him at the gate on schedule, and by the time Kanoha's alarm systems caught up to what had already happened, Sasuke Uchiha was an hour gone, moving fast and light toward a border he had no intention of ever crossing back over. Naruto heard the news standing in Tsunede's office, and the world went very quiet and very far away for the several seconds it took him to fully understand the shape of what he was being told. "I'm putting together a retrieval team," Shikamaru said, already moving, already thinking 3 steps ahead in the specific tired, competent way he'd inherited from a clan built for exactly this kind of crisis. "Kiba, Neji, Chaoji, and Naruto, you're coming, obviously." They caught the Sound Four's trail before dawn, and the chase that followed split apart the way these things always eventually split apart, Chaoji falling behind to hold a choke point against an enemy built like a small mountain, Neji peeling off into a forest thick with poisoned webbing, Kiba and Akamaru vanishing into a fight against something that seemed, impossibly, to be 2 people sharing one body. Shikamaru bought the rest of them time against a girl with a flute and 3 summoned demons at a cost Naruto didn't fully understand until much later. And by the time the sun had fully risen, Naruto was alone, running flat out through unfamiliar terrain, following a trail that grew fresher with every mile until it finally led him to a valley he'd never seen before and would never, for the rest of his life, be able to forget. 2 enormous stone figures faced each other across a wide river gorge, ancient and weathered, carved in the likeness of men who had shaped the entire elemental nation's history with their bare hands and hadn't managed, even so, to avoid destroying each other in the process. Sasuke stood on the palm of one statue, waiting, like he'd known all along exactly where this was going to end and had simply been giving Naruto time to catch up to it. "You don't have to do this," Naruto called across the gap, breathing hard, 12 years of complicated devotion crowding every word. "Whatever he's promising you, I'll help you find another way. We'll find Itachi together, you don't understand what I need," Sasuke said, and something in his voice, quiet and absolutely certain, landed on Naruto with a weight that felt older than the words themselves deserved to carry. The same low hum of recognition he'd felt the day they'd first met, except sharper now, closer to the surface. Like a held note finally resolving toward the chord it had always been reaching for. He didn't know why hearing Sasuke say, "I need," made something in his own chest ache with a grief that felt bigger than friendship, bigger than rivalry, closer to the specific ache of watching someone you'd already sworn yourself to walk toward a fire you couldn't talk them out of. He didn't examine it. He didn't have time to. Sasuke was already moving. The fight that followed was, for its first several exchanges, something close to an even match. 2 boys who'd trained together, fought together, bled for each other more times than either would ever admit out loud, testing each other with a ferocity that had grief tangled up so thoroughly with violence that neither emotion was fully separable from the other anymore. Naruto held his own longer than he had any right to. It wasn't until Sasuke, cornered and furious and unwilling to lose to the one person whose respect he'd never quite managed to stop wanting, reached for the curse mark and let it fully take him, black markings spreading across his skin, a pair of raw, hand-shaped wings tearing free from his back, power roaring up through him in a wave that had nothing human left in its shape at all, that the fight stopped being close. Naruto felt the shift in the air before he saw it happen, a pressure drop like the moment before a storm breaks, and understood, with the same wordless certainty that had once told him a hawk's shadow was already circling overhead in the forest of death, that he was about to need every single thing he'd been afraid to use freely since the day he found out what it cost. He reached for the unalloyed needle first, a habit worn into him over months of Jiraiya's careful supervision, and drove it home at his wrist even mid-fight, buying himself one precious hour of clarity in the middle of a battle that was rapidly becoming the most dangerous thing he'd ever stood inside of. It helped. It didn't save him from what came next. Sasuke fought with a speed and savagery the curse-marked second stage granted him, wings cutting the air, a Chidori crackling in his palm with a pitch that sounded less like birdsong now and more like something screaming. And Naruto met him with everything the rot would give him, the red-brown haze rising off his skin in a column thick enough to blur the air around him, blade-shaped constructs forming and dissolving and reforming across both hands as he traded blow for blow with a boy who had, until a few months ago, been the closest thing to a brother he'd ever had. The grass on the cliffside beneath them died in widening black circles wherever Naruto's feet touched down. The river below churned white where stray Chidori and Rasengan alike tore chunks from the gorge wall. Somewhere in the middle of that long, terrible exchange, he could never afterward pin down exactly when, Naruto felt something in him shift from fighting to win into something else entirely. A wordless, bone-deep certainty that winning was never actually the point of this particular fight. That some far older, far more devoted part of him wasn't trying to defeat the boy across from him at all. It was trying to keep a promise it didn't remember making. He didn't understand the thought, even as it moved through him. He didn't have time to. Sasuke was already gathering the last of his chakra into a single, final Chidori, wings spread. Eyes burning red with a Sharingan that had matured, in the space of this one fight, past anything either of them had seen it do before. And Naruto, exhausted, bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts, pulled the last and worst of what the rot would give him up through his own chest and into a Rasengan gone the deep, wet color of an old wound, and threw himself forward to meet it. The two techniques collided somewhere over the middle of that ruined gorge, and for one suspended half-second, neither boy fully understood which one of them was going to survive the exchange. Sasuke's Chidori found its mark first, driven not for Naruto's chest, the way instinct and training would have aimed it, but redirected at the last possible instant by Naruto's own arm thrown up in a desperate, reflexive block, some deep and ancient part of him choosing, without asking permission from the rest of him, that losing a limb was an acceptable price for staying alive to keep whatever promise he still didn't understand. The lightning tore into rot-corrupted flesh that had never fully finished healing since the invasion, and the two forces, pure destructive chakra meeting something already halfway to ruin, did not simply wound the arm. They consumed it, the corrosion racing up from wrist to elbow to shoulder in the space of a single heartbeat, sealing itself shut behind the damage with the same reflexive, self-preserving instinct that had once closed a scraped knee wrong way round when he was 3 years old. And Naruto's right arm ceased, in the span of about 2 seconds, to exist as anything more than a cauterized stump. He didn't scream. He didn't have breath left to scream with. His Rasengan connected a fraction of a second later, driven home with everything his remaining body could still give it, and Sasuke went down hard against the statue's stone palm, wings guttering out, curse mark receding back into ordinary skin as his chakra finally, catastrophically, ran dry. For one strange, floating instant, lying in the wreckage of a fight that had cost them both everything they'd had left to spend, Naruto saw something. It wasn't a memory that belonged to him. He understood that, somehow, even as it moved through him, a flash of golden light on a dying tree, Wings made of something that wasn't feathers, a voice that was and wasn't his own murmuring an apology to a brother who wasn't Sasuke, and yet, in the strange logic of the vision, absolutely was. I finally met my match, the voice said, gentle, unbearably sad, entirely at peace with an ending it had chosen with open eyes. I'm sorry. He understood, for one whole heartbeat, exactly what he had actually been fighting for on that cliffside. Not victory. Not even Sasuke's safety in the ordinary sense, but something older. Some vow sworn long before either of them had been born into this life. And he reached for the understanding the way you reach for a name on the tip of your tongue. It slipped away from him before he could close his hand around it. By the time the rain started, sudden, cold, sweeping down the gorge in gray sheets that soaked through what was left of his jacket, he had nothing left of the vision at all except the ache of having briefly, completely understood something enormous, and the far worse ache of having already, irretrievably, lost it again. Sasuke stood over him for a long time in that rain, breathing hard, one hand pressed to a shoulder that would carry a faint, strange, rot-dark scar for the rest of his life. No matter how many medical nin eventually looked at it, he could have finished it. Naruto, half-conscious and missing an arm, offered no resistance he could have needed to overcome. Sasuke stood there instead, staring down at him with an expression that held more grief in it than triumph, and said nothing at all for the better part of a minute. "You're an idiot," he said finally, echoing, without seeming to notice he was doing it, the exact words he'd used the first week they'd ever fought side by side. His voice cracked, once, in a way he would have been furious at himself for later if there'd been anyone left in that valley to witness it. "You should have let me go clean." He turned and walked away across the statue's outstretched palm without looking back, disappearing into the rain and the tree line beyond it with the specific, final quality of someone crossing a border he genuinely believed he was never coming back from. Naruto lay alone in the wreckage of the Valley of the End for a long time afterward, rain washing the blood from his face faster than his body could account for it, staring up at a gray sky with a cauterized stump where his arm used to be and a hollow, aching absence where a memory that wasn't quite his own had been for one perfect second, close enough to touch. He didn't cry this time. He was too empty for it. He simply lay there, listening to the river below carry on the way it always had, indifferent to the two boys who had nearly killed each other on its banks. And thought, with the last clear thought he had before the retrieval team finally found him hours later, that whatever he'd almost remembered had felt less like a warning and more like a promise he was somehow, impossibly, still keeping, even now, even like this, even with no memory left of ever having made it. Tsunade tried first to give him back an ordinary arm. It was the obvious answer, the humane one, the kind of solution a Hokage who genuinely loved this particular idiot boy would naturally reach for first. Grafts, regenerative jutsu, the very best of what Senju medical technique had refined across 3 generations of careful, patient study. She tried for the better part of a month, in a private ward sealed off from anyone without direct clearance, and every single attempt ended the same way. Healthy tissue offered to the wound simply refused to take, sloughing away within hours as though the stump itself had decided, with quiet and total finality, that it wasn't interested in being ordinary again. "It's not rejecting the grafts," she told Jiraiya, exhausted, on the 9th failed attempt. "It's replacing them. There's something underneath directing the regrowth, and it isn't following any biology I've ever studied." What grew back, over the following 6 weeks, without any medical intervention at all, was not an arm in any sense either of them recognized. It began as a thin, hardened lattice beneath the sealed stump, crystalline, faintly translucent, the deep wine red of something between garnet and dried blood. And it grew the way coral grows, patient and structural, building itself outward joint by joint until it had, by the end of that first month, produced something that moved like an arm, gripped like an arm, even seemed to carry sensation like an arm, while being made of nothing that any medical nin in the village could classify as living flesh. Naruto flexed the new hand for the first time in front of a small, careful audience. Tsunade, Jiraiya, the seal master who'd built the unalloyed needle, and watched thin, deep red lines of light travel along its structure like something between chakra and blood, pulsing faintly in time with his own heartbeat. "It doesn't hurt," he offered into the heavy silence that followed. "I mean, it did growing in. It doesn't now." "That's not really what's worrying us, sweetheart," Tsunade said, and meant it kindly, and didn't manage to make it sound any less frightening. They called it, eventually, without much ceremony, the unalloyed arm, a private joke of Jiraiya's, borrowed from an old, half-remembered folk phrase about things too pure to corrupt further, that stuck mostly because nobody could think of anything better. It gave Naruto raw physical power he hadn't had before, a permanent baseline strength increase that made his taijutsu noticeably sharper within weeks of learning to use it properly. It also meant, as Tsunade told him plainly and did not soften for his sake, that whatever slept at the root of his chakra was no longer sealed safely 2 layers deep in his own body. It was, now, one skin's thickness from the surface at all times, riding along in a limb he used every single day without thinking twice about it. "Every emotion that used to just make your chest tight," she told him, "is going to have a much shorter road to that arm from now on. I need you to understand that before you go back out into the field." Naruto understood. He didn't fully believe yet how much it would end up mattering. The 2.5 years that followed did what time always does, wore some things smooth and left others permanently sharp. He trained until his old limits stopped meaning anything, learned the toad summons properly, built a working relationship with the fox curled inside him that had, slowly and without either of them quite admitting it out loud, stopped being pure antagonism and started resembling something closer to a wary, mutual alliance against a shared third problem neither of them had chosen. "You understand," Kurama told him once, in the strange internal quiet of deep meditation, in a voice that carried none of its old contempt anymore, "that I am the only reason you're not already dead. Every time you're grateful for my chakra, you should also be a little afraid of what it's actually holding down." "I know," Naruto said. "I think about it a lot." "Good," Kurama said. "Keep thinking about it. The day you stop is probably the day it stops needing my permission." The village's relationship with him, over those same 2.5 years, fractured in ways that never fully healed either. There were people, Iruka always, and Kanoha, and the slow, grudging respect of shinobi who'd fought alongside him and seen exactly what he was willing to spend to protect them, who never once flinched. There were others, greater in number than Naruto ever let himself dwell on too long, who crossed the street when they saw the faint red glow beneath his sleeve, who taught their children a version of caution that looked, from the outside, uncomfortably close to fear. Tsunade shielded him from the worst of the official pressure with the same fierce, unglamorous stubbornness she brought to everything else that mattered to her. It cost her politically, in ways Naruto only half understood at the time. He would understand the full shape of that cost much later, and by then it would be too late to properly thank her for it. The mission to retrieve Gaara came without warning, the way the worst missions always did, and Naruto knew from the moment Tsunade's face went carefully, deliberately blank, giving the briefing that whatever they were walking into wasn't going to end the way any of them wanted it to. They arrived in Suna 2 days, after Akatsuki had already come and gone. Deidara and Sasori had extracted the one-tail from Gaara with the same clinical, patient efficiency Kasama had once described to his own organization's leadership, a process that took the better part of a full day, immobilizing Gaara at the center of a summoned statue built from the corpses of long-dead Jinchuriki, drawing Shukaku's chakra out through 9 ghostly conduits in a ritual that left absolutely nothing behind for Mercy to work with. By the time the retrieval team fought their way through Sasori's puppet defenses and Deidara's explosive escape, Gaara's body lay exactly where the extraction had left it, still and pale, emptied of the very thing that had made his whole life, for better and infinitely for worse. What it had been. Naruto had seen dead bodies before. He had never, until that moment, looked at one and understood with total visceral clarity that he was looking at his own possible future laid out plainly on cold sand for him to study. This is what it looks like, he thought, kneeling beside Gaara's body while Kankuro's ragged, furious grief filled the small stone chamber around them when they take it out clean. He thought of Kasame's report, relayed to him secondhand by Jiraiya months earlier. I don't think extraction protocols are going to work clean on this one. And understood, finally, in his bones rather than in the abstract, careful way Tsunade had always explained it to him, that not clean didn't mean he'd simply survive where Gaara hadn't. It meant something considerably worse than dying might be waiting on the other side of an extraction attempt made on him specifically. And that nobody in this world, not even the people trying hardest to protect him, actually knew what that something looked like. Chiyo, the old woman who had once helped design the very weapon that killed Gaara's mother, spent the last reserves of her own long, complicated life pouring them into a forbidden technique that traded her remaining years for his, a grandmother's final apology, offered wordlessly. To a village and a grandson she had both, in different ways, failed for decades before finally getting something right. Gaara opened his eyes an hour later, alive, hollow, and permanently changed by an absence he would spend the rest of his life learning to live inside of. Naruto held his hand through the worst of the returning consciousness and didn't say any of the several things crowding his throat, because none of them were really about Gaara at all. Tsunade received Naruto's mission report 3 days after the retrieval team returned, and it was reading his own quiet, careful account of standing over Gaara's emptied body that finally made her do something she'd been putting off. With the specific dread of a doctor who already suspects the answer, for the better part of a year. She ran the full diagnostic herself, alone in the same warded room where the seal master had first found the stain 7 years earlier, measuring not just the unalloyed arm's steady, crystalline growth, but the deeper signature underneath it, the thing Kurama's chakra had been quietly, exhaustingly holding in place since the night it was sealed. The numbers, when she finished, did not match anything she'd projected the previous year. It had grown. Not dramatically, not in any single visible burst she could point to and blame on one incident, the Forest of Death, the invasion, the Valley of the End, but steadily, incrementally, the specific slow arithmetic of something patient enough to measure its own progress in years rather than days. She ran the numbers twice, hoping for an error, and got the same answer both times. She sat alone in that warded room for a long time afterward, the diagnostic scroll unrolled across her lap, doing the kind of math no Hokage ever wanted to be the one holding. At the current rate, by her most conservative estimate, Kurama's chakra would no longer be sufficient to hold the rot in stable containment within 3 years. Possibly less, if Naruto was called on, even once more, to spend himself the way he'd spent himself at the Valley of the End. She thought of the letter still folded in her own desk drawer now, passed down to her the way it had once been passed to Jiraiya. Protect him, not the village's investment in him, and understood, with a physician's cold and unforgiving clarity, that she had just been handed a countdown with no clear way to stop it, and considerably less time on the clock than she had let herself believe. The letter that told Naruto his teacher was dead was 3 lines long, written in Tsunade's own hand because she refused to let anyone else be the one to deliver it, and Naruto read it standing in the middle of a training field with the unalloyed arm hanging useless at his side. As though some part of his own body had already understood, before the rest of him caught up, that there was nothing left in that moment worth being strong for. Jiraiya had died the way he'd lived, reckless, generous, spending the very last of himself gathering intelligence that would, in the weeks that followed, prove to be the only reason Kanoha survived what came next. He'd found the truth about pain, about the 6 bodies moving as one under a single ruined will, and paid for that knowledge with everything he had left to spend. Naruto did not cry where anyone could see him. He found, 3 days later, that he didn't fully need to. Grief had settled into him differently since the Valley of the End, less like a flood and more like something the rot itself seemed to metabolize, quietly in the dark. The way it metabolized everything else he fed it, without asking permission first. Pain came for Kanoha on a clear morning, and by the time the sun set on that same day, most of the village Naruto had spent his whole life fighting to be accepted by no longer existed as anything but a wide, smoking crater. 6 bodies, moved as extensions of a single crippled will hidden somewhere behind them, tore through Kanoha's defenses with a calm, methodical inevitability that made every shinobi who'd ever called themselves elite understand, within minutes, exactly how outmatched they actually were. Naruto arrived in the middle of it, wearing Sage Mode for the first time in true combat, and even that, hard-won, natural energy balanced with a precision that had taken him years to master. Barely held the line long enough for the truth beneath pain's assault to finally surface. Nagato, a boy once, who had watched war take everything he loved before he was old enough to fully understand what war even was, who had built an entire philosophy of peace through shared pain out of a grief too enormous for any single person to carry alone, and who had, somewhere along that long road, lost the ability to tell the difference between ending suffering and simply spreading it more evenly. Naruto talked to him, in the wreckage of what used to be a village, in the specific way he had always talked to people the rest of the world had already given up on, not with strength, though he had plenty of that left to spend, but with the same stubborn refusal to accept that anyone was truly beyond reaching that had once, years ago, convinced a bitter, broken man on a bridge to reconsider everything he thought he believed. It worked in the end, the way it had worked before, imperfectly, expensively, and just barely in time. Nagato spent the last of his own life reviving everyone pain had killed in that assault, an act of genuine, exhausted repentance that cost him everything he had left, and died in the arms of the only person in the world who had ever truly loved him, in a reign that Kanoha would remember, for years afterward, as the day grief and mercy finally arrived in the same weather. Tsunade, who had spent nearly every reserve of chakra she owned holding the village's remaining defenses together long enough for Naruto's confrontation to matter, collapsed at the height of the battle and did not wake for many weeks afterward. The village she'd rebuilt from nothing twice already now needed rebuilding a third time, and this time there was no one obvious left standing to hold the hat while she recovered. Danzo Shimura took the seat he had wanted for decades within the week, installed by a council too shattered and exhausted to put up meaningful resistance, and began, almost immediately, drafting the paperwork that would have finally, formally classified Naruto Uzumaki as a weapon of the village rather than a citizen of it. He never got the chance to sign it. Sasuke Uchiha arrived in the wreckage of Kanoha 11 days into Danzo's brief regency, older, colder, carrying 2.5 years of training that had reshaped him into something far more dangerous than the boy who'd left at the Valley of the End, and found the man who had orchestrated his entire clan's massacre sitting, for the first time in Sasuke's whole life, somewhere close enough to reach. What happened between them was not, by any measure, a fair fight, and Sasuke did not walk away from it particularly interested in whether it had been won. Danzo Shimura's decades of careful, patient scheming ended in a private room that no official report would ever fully, honestly describe. And Sasuke left the village again within the hour, his single piece of unfinished business in Kanoha, for the moment, finally closed. He did not, this time, go far. Naruto found him 3 days later at the edge of a forest, an hour's walk from the village, sitting alone against the base of an old, enormous tree, waiting with the specific patience of someone who had known, with total certainty, exactly where and when this particular meeting was going to happen. "You killed Danzo," Naruto said, not quite a question. "I did," Sasuke said without apology, without triumph either. It needed doing. You know it needed doing, whatever the council decides to call it. They looked at each other for a long moment across a clearing that felt, to Naruto, unnervingly familiar, though he couldn't place why. A strange, low hum of recognition moving through him the same way it had the very first day they'd met, except louder now. Closer to something with actual words attached to it, words he still couldn't quite make himself hear. "I've been looking into something," Sasuke said, "since the valley. Old Uchiha records, things Itachi left behind that I didn't understand until recently. Records older than that too, from before the Sage of Six Paths. Buried places our clan's founders apparently thought important enough to preserve even after they stopped fully believing in them." "What kind of records?" "The kind that explain why you've always felt like someone I already knew," Sasuke said, quiet, watching him carefully. "Why you fought at the valley the way you did. Why some part of you didn't try to win that fight so much as it tried to finish something." Naruto's chest went tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the specific vertigo of hearing someone else finally say out loud a thing he'd spent years refusing to look at directly. "Sasuke, we made a vow," Sasuke said, and something in his voice, for the first time since Naruto had found him in that clearing, cracked open into something that sounded almost like grief. "Not in this life. Before it. I don't fully understand the shape of it. The records are old and fragmented, and half of them don't even agree with each other, but I understand enough. You were sworn to me, Naruto, not as a friend, as something closer to, as the blade meant to finish what I couldn't finish alone." "Finish what?" "A world that doesn't run on hatred passed down like an inheritance," Sasuke said, and there was nothing false in it, nothing performed, just 2.5 years of grief and fury and impossible, unbearable conviction, finally given a name he actually believed in. "Every cage system this world has ever built runs on the same lie, that peace comes from someone strong enough to hold everyone else's hatred at bay. It doesn't work. It's never worked. Itachi died believing it might, and it cost him everything, and it changed nothing. I'm not going to make his mistake. I'm going to take all of it, every grudge, every war, every reason the 5 nations have ever found to bleed each other, onto myself alone, so no one else ever has to carry it again." "That's not peace, Sasuke. That's just you standing in the fire instead of everybody else." "Maybe," Sasuke said, "but someone has to stand in it. I've decided it should be me." He looked at Naruto with an intensity that made the old, wordless recognition in Naruto's chest ache all the way down to whatever slept beneath his ribs. "I can't do it with the power I have. Not enough to make the whole world listen, not enough to end it clean instead of dragging it out over another generation of dead children." "But he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to." Naruto felt the shape of what came next arrive in his own body before Sasuke ever said it aloud. A cold, sick certainty rising up from the same deep place the memory flash at the Valley of the End had come from. "You want the rest of it," Naruto said, very quietly. "Not the waterfowl dance. Not what I used against Gaara, all of it, whatever's under Kurama." "I want what you already promised me once," Sasuke said. "In a life neither of us remembers making the promise in. I'm not asking you to hand it over blind, Naruto. I'm asking you to finish what you started at that valley. Together, we could actually end this, not manage it, not pass it down to the next generation to bleed over again. End it." Naruto's hands were shaking by the time Sasuke finished speaking, and it took him a long moment to understand that the shaking wasn't fear. Or wasn't only fear. It was recognition, sharp and total, the old vow finally surfacing whole instead of in fragments, and some ancient, devoted part of him straining toward Sasuke's offer with a hunger that had nothing to do with his own conscious will at all. "Don't," Kurama's voice said, low and urgent, somewhere in the back of his own skull, sharper than Naruto had ever heard it. "Whatever that boy is asking you for, it isn't a gift he's owed. It's a door I have spent 13 years standing in front of. Don't open it because an old promise is telling you it's already yours to give." "I felt it too," Naruto said out loud, to both of them at once, voice unsteady. "At the valley. I felt like I was keeping a promise I didn't remember making. I still feel it right now, Sasuke, looking at you, like some part of me wants to just say yes and let whatever's under my ribs finish deciding this instead of me. Then let it, Sasuke said low, almost gentle, closing the distance between them. You don't have to understand it fully to trust it, Naruto. You never have. That's always been the whole shape of you. He reached out, not violently, not even urgently, just certain. The way you reach for something you've already been promised belongs to you. And the moment his hand closed around Naruto's wrist, the ancient thing curled at the root of Naruto's chakra network, answered a call it had apparently, across 2 lifetimes, never once stopped waiting to answer. The bloom that followed did not ask Naruto's permission. Villagers 3 streets away, still picking through the wreckage Pain had left behind, felt the pressure change before they saw anything. A drop in the air like the moment before a landslide lets go. By the time they looked up, the sky above the forest's edge had gone the deep, wet color of an old wound, a column of light thick as blood rising into the clouds, and something enormous and terrible was unfurling itself at the center of it, wings, vast and wrong, built from 1,000 small dark shapes moving in unison, and beneath them, barely recognizable anymore as the boy who had once cried openly at 2 strangers' funerals in the land of waves, something that was rapidly ceasing to be a boy at all. Naruto felt it happening from the inside and understood, with a horror that cut through even the vow's ancient, patient pull, that this time, for the first time in his whole life, he wasn't at all certain he still had the strength left in him to stop it. The wings kept unfurling. That was the part none of the watching villagers would ever fully find words for afterward. Not the color, not the size, but the sheer, patient unhurriedness of it, as though something that had been waiting since before the god tree first bore fruit had finally been given permission to stop pretending it was in any rush. Inside it, Naruto was disappearing, and the worst part, the part he would remember most clearly, in the rare, careful moments in years to come when he let himself remember any of this at all, was how much it didn't feel like dying. It felt like arriving. Like a held breath he'd been keeping his whole life finally let all the way out, a vow 2 lifetimes deep finally closing its circle, and some patient, ancient piece of him whispered, in a voice that was and wasn't his own, that this was simply what he had always actually been for. Fight it, Kurama snarled, somewhere in the collapsing architecture of Naruto's own mind, his voice the only fixed point left in a self that was rapidly ceasing to have edges. I don't care what promise you think you owe him. I have spent 13 years holding a door shut so you could keep being a person. Don't you dare open it now and call it destiny. It doesn't feel like a choice, Naruto said, or thought, or whatever the dissolving version of speech was becoming inside a mind losing its own shape. It feels like coming home. Home doesn't cost you your name, Kurama said, fierce, furious, frightened in a way Naruto had genuinely never heard from him before. Whatever's singing to you right now, boy, it isn't a homecoming. It's an appetite, and it has finally, after 13 years, found something worth finishing its meal over. I need you to hear my voice over its and choose, not the vow's choice, yours. Something in that, yours, snagged on the unraveling edge of him and held. Sasuke watched the wings spread wider over the wreckage of Kanoha and felt, for the first time since he'd reached out and closed his hand around Naruto's wrist, a horror that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with a feeling he had spent 2.5 years training himself not to have any more. He had told himself, walking toward this clearing 3 days ago, that this would feel like completion, an old promise finally honored, a tool finally put to its rightful use, the last piece of a plan that would end, permanently, a cycle of hatred that had already cost him everyone he'd ever loved. He had not told himself, because some careful, guarded part of him hadn't wanted to know the answer in advance. What it would actually feel like to watch the boy underneath all of it stop being recognizable as a person at all. Naruto's face, in the brief moments still visible through the rising crimson light, no longer looked like someone choosing anything. It looked like someone being erased. Longing, not malice, some old, buried part of Sasuke's own conscience offered, unbidden, in a voice that sounded uncomfortably like his brother's. You wanted a gentler world. You did not want this specific cost, paid by this specific person, and you know it. Naruto? Sasuke's voice cracked on the name, and he was moving before he'd finished deciding to move, closing the distance to the center of that terrible bloom with his own hand already extended. Not to complete the vow this time, but to try. With whatever strength he had left after killing Danzo 3 days earlier, to pull it back. Naruto, stop! This isn't what I— The wings answered him with a lash of raw, corrosive pressure that threw him 30 feet backward into the shattered remains of a building. And it took him a long, winded moment on the ground, staring up at the impossible column of light rising over the village he'd just returned to understand the second horrible truth of that afternoon. He had started something he no longer had any power to stop. The unalloyed needle was still sealed in a small pouch at Naruto's hip, exactly where it had been every day for the last 2.5 years. And it was Kurama, not Naruto, not anymore. Naruto barely had enough of himself left to hear his own name. Who found the last remaining thread of will strong enough to reach for it. This was built for a spark, Kurama said, urgent, pouring his own chakra forward in a way that cost him more than he'd ever willingly spent on a human vessel in his entire long, furious life, wrapping around the boy's dissolving hand to steady fingers that no longer entirely remembered how to hold anything. Not a wildfire. I don't know if it will hold against this. I know it's the only thing either of us has left to try. The needle went in at the same point on his wrist it always had, and this time the relief that followed wasn't gentle. It tore through him like a blade through a wound already too far gone to close cleanly. Kurama's own chakra bracing the technique from collapsing outright, feeding it everything he had, one entire tail's worth of his own ancient reserve burned away in a single catastrophic instant to keep the seal from simply shattering under the weight of what it was being asked to hold. For one suspended, agonizing second, nothing happened at all, and the wings kept spreading, and somewhere very far away Naruto heard Sasuke's voice screaming his name into the wreckage, and further away still, older and quieter and closer to the center of everything, he heard another voice. Not Kurama's, not his own. A woman's voice, warm and worn and terribly familiar, though he had never once heard it in his life. I hope you never need what's written here, Kushina's voice said, from ink on old paper 2.5 years gone now, folded so many times into the shape of his own resolve that it had never really left him at all. But if you do, I made sure it would be waiting. He reached for the memory of her the same helpless, grasping way he'd once reached for a flash of golden wings, and a dying apology at the Valley of the End. And this time, he didn't lose his grip on it. He chose, not the vow, not the ancient, patient hunger that had been waiting his entire life, across 2 lifetimes, for exactly this permission. He chose, instead, the specific, unglamorous human weight of everyone who had ever looked at him and seen a person worth protecting rather than a weapon worth wielding. Iruka's headband tied around a crying 12-year-old's forehead, Sakura's hands refusing to let go of his wrist in a dying clearing. Tsunede's careful diagnostics run late into the night by someone who had never once stopped trying to give him a normal life, even when normal had clearly stopped being an option years ago. Jiraiya's terrible jokes and genuine, unglamorous love and, underneath and around, and through all of it, impossible to fully separate anymore. Sasuke, screaming his name into wreckage with a horror that had nothing performed in it at all. He drove the choice down through the needle like a nail through green wood, sealing not the rot itself. That was never fully possible. Kushina's own notes had been clear about that from the very beginning, but the door above it, the specific threshold between Stage 5 and Stage 6, the line between a power he had learned, however painfully, to survive, and a power that would have finished the job of erasing him completely. The wings didn't vanish gently. They came apart the way a held breath comes apart when you finally, exhaustedly, let it go, all at once. all the crimson light collapsing inward toward a single point, the pressure over the village breaking with a sound like the sky itself exhaling. And Naruto fell the last 4 feet to the scorched earth beneath him as a person again. Fully, completely, and unmistakably a person, for the first time in almost 20 minutes that had felt, from the inside, like several private lifetimes. He did not fall alone. Sasuke reached him half a second before he hit the ground, catching him under the arms, and neither of them said anything at all for a long time afterward. 2 boys kneeling in the wreckage of a village that had already survived far more than its fair share of catastrophe that particular year. Both of them shaking for reasons that had stopped, somewhere in the last 20 minutes, being separable from each other. The cost revealed itself slowly, over the following days, the way costs like this always did. The unalloyed arm had gone dull. The deep wine-red light that once pulsed along its crystalline structure faded now to something closer to old, tarnished glass. Still functional, still strong, but unmistakably, permanently quieter than it had been. Tsunade's diagnostics, run the moment she was well enough to insist on running them herself, confirmed what Naruto had already felt in his own body before anyone told him. The door to stage 5 and beyond was sealed, not temporarily, not pending future training, but the way a door seals when the frame around it has been permanently welded shut. Waterfowl dance. Scarlet Ionia. Whatever the god of rot might have eventually become, fully grown, all of it gone, folded away behind a threshold he had chosen with his own hands to close forever. "You'll live longer this way," Kurama told him, quieter than usual, still recovering himself from the cost of what he'd spent to hold that seal together. "I want you to understand that clearly before you spend the rest of your life mourning something you gave up on purpose. I would have run out of tales to spend eventually. You would not have survived the day I did." "I know," Naruto said. "Doesn't mean I don't feel it, like losing the arm all over again, except this time I can't even point to where it used to be." Sasuke visited him twice more before he left the village again. Not fled this time, not the way he had at the Valley of the End, but walked out through the front gate in daylight. Having spoken with Tsunade at length about a path forward that involved considerably more patience and considerably less unilateral godhood than the one he'd arrived with 3 days earlier. "I'm not giving up on what I believe," he told Naruto, standing at the gate, and there was no apology in it, because Sasuke had never fully learned how to apologize, and Naruto had, by now, stopped expecting him to. "The world still runs on an inheritance of hatred it needs to stop passing down. I still intend to do something about that. Just maybe not by turning me into a weapon first," Naruto said. "Maybe not," Sasuke agreed, "and something that might, in a few more years, eventually grow into something like peace between them passed quietly across his face. I'm sorry for what I almost cost you. I don't think I understood until I watched it happening what I was actually asking for." "I know," Naruto said again, and meant, this time, something closer to forgiveness than he fully understood himself. Kanoha rebuilt itself a 3rd time, slower now, more carefully, and the village's relationship with the boy who had twice now been seen glowing with something ancient and terrible over its ruins never fully settled back into anything simple. Some people crossed the street. Some people, more than before, didn't. Children who had watched the sky open over the village that afternoon grew up telling a version of the story that got a little larger and a little stranger with every retelling. Until Naruto Uzumaki became, in the mouths of people who hadn't been there, something closer to a legend than a neighbor. A boy who had once, briefly, worn the shape of a god and chosen with his own 2 hands to set it back down. He didn't correct the stories much. There wasn't, in the end, a version of the truth simple enough to hand back to people who needed it simple. He visited the memorial stone often, in the years that followed, adding names he hadn't expected to add so soon, and sitting with the ones already carved there far longer than most people thought was healthy. He kept training, kept growing, kept becoming, slowly and unglamorously, The kind of shinobi people in Kanoha eventually stopped being afraid of and started, instead, simply calling Naruto again. No titles, no legends, just a name worn back down over years of ordinary, patient kindness into something people could actually hold without flinching. He never got the waterfowl dance back. He never tried to. On the rare quiet evenings when he let himself think about it honestly, sitting alone somewhere with the tarnished glass of his own arm catching the last of the sunset, he understood that he had never actually lost a battle at all, not really, not in any way that mattered. He had simply been the first person, in 2 impossibly long lifetimes, ever given the chance to choose. And unlike the woman whose soul had once worn his shape long before he existed to carry it, unlike a warrior who bloomed twice and apologized to a brother who never fully deserved the apology, Naruto Uzumaki had looked at the same terrible, beautiful, world-ending gift and set it down on his own 2 feet, walking away from it not in defeat, but in the quiet, permanent peace of someone who had finally, after a lifetime of being told what he carried made him a monster, gotten to decide for himself what kind of person he actually wanted to be. It cost him almost everything he had left to spend. He would, if anyone ever asked him honestly, tell them it had been worth every last piece of it.